Dobrý večer, vitajte. And that was the last sentence in Slovak, which will be said today in the evening. We have a special lecture, which will be held in English because of our guest, and I am very happy to welcome here Jon Stewart, an American philosopher who is staying now or living now in Bratislava for some 4 years. And he wrote a book in Bratislava, which was published last year in Cambridge University Press. It's this book, Hegel's Century. So it's a book about the history of 19th century, and the book got a prestigious American prize, Prose, awarded by the publishers in the United States for the best philosophical book in the world for the year 2021. So that's really a surprising fact that such a distinguished philosopher from America, but he was also teaching in many other places, Copenhagen, Harvard, etc. Now he's staying as a research fellow at the Philosophical Institute of Slovak Academy of Science. Today's topic is the Hegel and his influence on Heine, Feuerbach, Marx, and the revolutionary year of 1848. And I will not be long, so just to pass the word for Jon and the lecture, which will be about 40-50 minutes, and then we will have a discussion. So you can also think about the questions during the lecture. Thank you very much for coming. Floor is yours, and we are all really looking forward for the performance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, the kind words. I'll do my best to make this a performance, which is, I guess, not necessarily what people are expecting when they hear the name Hegel. Usually people associate Hegel with very tedious reading and the very boring philosophical topics, but I will try to convince you that that's a mistaken picture today. So, what I want to do today is tell you a little bit about the book and my idea behind it. Of course, it's impossible to condense a large book into just a quick 50-minute lecture, so I tried to isolate one specific strand to give you a sense of what I'm trying to do in the book. So, so that's the plan. I have a fair amount of stuff I want to go through since it's a historical sort of a text. We have to trace the idea historically through a few different thinkers. So let me just go ahead and jump right into this. When Hegel came to Berlin in 1818, he was already quite a well-known philosopher at the time. He'd written a number of books which were already, in his lifetime, rather famous. Of course, the Phenomenology of Spirit is his early work, which everybody knows, from 1807. He had also authored in 3 volumes the book The Science of Logic, starting in 1812. And then, of course, his outline of his basic philosophical system, the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, in 1817. And so by the time he got this position at the Royal Friedrich Wilhelms University in Berlin, he was a famous philosopher, and the authorities in the Kingdom of Prussia, they thought that he's really our leading philosopher in the German-speaking world, and so they thought that Hegel would be the appropriate person to replace the Fichte, who was his predecessor in that position. And so during Hegel's time in Berlin, he spent really the rest of his career there from 1818 to 1831. he gave a series of different lectures which became extremely popular and attracted students from not just the Prussia and the German states, but also from all over Europe. And so here we can see just a few of them. We have a number of famous names here in 19th century philosophy: Ludwig Feuerbacha, Bruno Bauer, Max Stirner, David Friedrich Strauss, and Heinrich Heine. These are what I refer to as the first generation of Hegel's students, that is, people who came to Berlin at some point in the 1820s, and they sat in Hegel's classroom and they heard his lectures. And then there's a second generation consisting of people like Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Soren Kierkegaard, Mikhail Bakunin, and Ivan Turgenev, who came to Berlin after Hegel's death in the 1830s and were there because they wanted to study with some of Hegel's own students. There was still an exciting atmosphere at the University of Berlin at that time surrounding Hegel's philosophy, even though Hegel himself had died a few years earlier. And so, yeah, this is, when you look at these names, you think, well, all of these people were inspired somehow by Hegel, and this is really a part of the premise of the book, that most people think that Hegel's philosophy was influential in maybe the 1820s or the 1830s, when the Hegel schools, the right and the left Hegelians, were active, but then it pretty much died off after that. And especially when we get into the second half of the century, Hegel's not really an influential figure at all. And I want to try to argue that that's not the case, that in fact Hegel's philosophy continued to live on very strongly through the work primarily of his famous students, who took certain key ideas from Hegel and reworked them in the context of their different philosophical programs. And so all of these people, when they got older, they looked back at their period in Berlin at this time with a great sense of nostalgia. They said there was a real magical atmosphere in Berlin, both in Hegel's own time and then afterwards, where people would get really excited about certain ideas that Hegel talked about in his lectures, and then they would go to the cafes or the beer halls and have a big debate about it. And we can see this in this citation from Mikhail Bakunin, who wrote this actually many, many decades later, still remembering back when he was a young student in Berlin. And he writes, quote, "Hegel died at the end of 1831. His students attracted a multitude of German and non-German intellects to Berlin as a vital source of new light, not to say new revelation. Unless you lived in those times, you will never understand how powerful the fascination of this philosophical system was in the 1830s and 1840s. So what was it about Hegel's thought? I mean, this is not just Bakunin. You can see people like Friedrich Engels, he writes very much in the same tone, also many years later, like in the 1870s, about how exciting this was. And so you think of that list of people who had very different sorts of political orientations or religious orientations, different philosophical agendas. What was it that they all found to be so interesting in Hegel, all found to be an important source for their own thinking? And so in this lecture, I will try to argue that one thing was the concept of alienation. And so there's a key concept which appears in Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of religion. And what I will try to illustrate is that this has an important impact on each of these. I will try to illustrate this through three different thinkers, how each of them tries to interpret that in a different setting and tries to make use of it for their own reasons. And so we think of the concept of alienation. What does that really mean, right? It's separation of two things, a division, right? I'm alienated from something outside of me, something is different from me. And so what's the opposite of that? It would be a sort of a reconciliation, right? When I'm reunited with something. And so these are, Hegel would say, they're dialectical concepts. They belong together, right? You can have a certain unity which divides and then is reconciled once again. And this is a basic movement in thought that Hegel is able to find in many different areas. And so this is the topic we want to talk about and to try to explore. Another main thesis that I want to argue for today is that the story of European philosophy in the 19th century can be understood really as the story of Hegel's philosophy and its development, which was disseminated and modified in different ways by his students. And that's why the name of the book is Hegel's Century, right? So the 19th century, with regard to its development of philosophy, can really be read as starting with Hegel at the beginning of the century and then living on through his students through the second half of the century as well. And an important part of the story, which is largely overlooked, is the role that Hegel's students play in the revolutions of 1848. And so this is really surprising to people, that usually when they think of Hegel and his social political philosophy, they think of him as a very conservative thinker, even a reactionary thinker. He's sometimes caricatured as the official philosopher of the state of Prussia. And so all of this speaks for not a very progressive philosophical tendency. And so people don't really think of Hegel as somebody who's a teacher or a source of inspiration for young radicals. I want to submit to you that this older picture is simply not correct, that in fact Hegel was the inspiration for all of these students that I showed just a moment ago, who were young radicals with regard to their politics for the most part, and that these figures were in fact pivotal in agitating for the revolutions of 1848. And so here is the outline of my lecture, if you want to make a note of this or take a quick picture of it. So I will start by examining the basic concept of alienation as it appears in Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of religion, and then I'll try to look at that concept as it appears in the development of the thought of three of his students, Heinrich Heine, Feuerbach from the first generation, that is, actually were in Hegel's lecture hall, and then Karl Marx, who belongs to the second generation of his students, and then we can try to put it all together and see what conclusions we can draw from that. And so we begin with Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of religion. So after Hegel's death in 1831, his students got together and decided to create the first collected works edition of his writings. And so they also decided to publish his lectures, which was a very important part of his reception. It was some of the most famous works that he himself ever had, even though he didn't write them. So these are student notes that they were putting together. And so the lectures on the philosophy of religion were published in 1832, only like a year and a half after his death, by one of his followers, a theologian named Philip Marheineke. And in these lectures, the concept of alienation plays an important role. And what do we mean by this in the context of religion? For Hegel, he traces a series of different religions. And in that account, what he's trying to do is say, how did the different religions understand God, the divine? What is their different conception? And he says, well, as we could predict, very many different ideas, that the God is represented as an animal, or as a a planet or as a natural force, right? There are many different conceptions of God in the history of the world religions. And Hegel talks about this as a form of alienation. What does he mean by that? When we look at an animal, when we look at a force of nature, this is not something that we immediately understand or can identify with. It's something different from us as human beings, something other. And so Hegel's thesis here is that he believes that Christianity is the religion which allows us to have a reconciliation with this conception of the divine, because in Christianity, right, we have a conception of God as a incarnated human being, right, as a self-conscious agent, just as we are, as self-conscious human beings. And so in this sense, we can have a form of identification or of reconciliation with God or with the divine, whereas he believes the earlier religions are still stuck in this conception of alienation with their different conceptions of the divine. Now, what does Hegel say about that specifically? Why does he believe this? If we think, for example, of the Christian dogmas of the revelation and the incarnation, this is exactly the point, right? That in the revelation, God reveals himself, right? In the incarnation, right? God is incarnated in human form, becomes human. And Hegel thinks these are key ideas, because with these ideas, people realize that God is not something out there somewhere in the universe in some transcendent sphere, but rather is here in our world and is like us, right? He uses the word spirit to say what we as human beings have in common with God, right? So we are self-conscious, we are rational, we are thinking, we have this principle which we share with God, which we don't share with, say, a force of nature or with an animal or a river or a star or something like that. And so it's through this concept of spirit where the idea of reconciliation appears for Hegel. So we can... the word Geist in German. What else does this tell us? If we understand God to be out there in some transcendent sphere, very far, very distant from us, then the idea is that everything which is true or everything which is valuable is there, right? It's with God, whereas our world, or mundane sphere, is devoid of truth, devoid of value, right? This is a part of the sense of alienation, that in that sense, if God is so distant, then it seems to undermine the conception that we have both of ourselves and our possibilities here on earth. But specifically with this idea of the incarnation, right? If God comes down from that transcendent sphere and enters into our sphere as a human being, then suddenly, what does that tell us? That tells us that truth is here in this world, that we can know the truth as well, because God is here around us, right? Is together with us. And this can also show us that our conception of individuality and subjectivity is important, right? That we can enter into a relation with God here in this sphere. It's not like we're forever separated from God in the beyond somewhere. And so this really changes the conception of one's relation to, not only to God, but also to oneself, to the world around one. And it has important implications for ways of thinking about ethics or social institutions or even legal practices. Think of, with the birth of Christianity in the Roman world, right? There was a long-standing tradition and practice of slavery in the Greco-Roman world going back centuries and centuries. The Christians couldn't accept this, right? Because they believed that each human being had something of the divine in them, right? And so they raised the value of what it is to be human. They couldn't accept human beings being enslaved. And this was a big point of pushback that they gave to the Roman Empire that the Romans could never really quite understand. And so they had this idea of the importance of a recognition of one another as fully free individuals, which had not existed in that form earlier, according to Hegel. And so, yeah, for Hegel, he calls Christianity also the religion of freedom in that sense, and that we can allow ourselves to be free and to be reconciled with the world around us and with this conception of the divine. It's not we're able to know the truth, right? We're able to know God, and God recognizes each of us as individuals, as self-conscious, rational thinking individuals, which are qualities that we share with God. And so with this, Hegel, he seems to give us a very positive story about how we overcome this sense of alienation with the divine, how Christianity manages to do this, whereas the other religions don't, and how this changes our conception of ourselves. And so all of this sounds fine. When we get to the end of the lectures, it sounds like Hegel is ending on a very positive note, that he is fulfilling what he said he was going to do at the beginning of the lectures, that is to restore the truth of Christianity. But then things are not quite so simple, actually. At the very end of his lectures, he changes the tone completely. And this is the surprising thing, I think, for most people, where he says that, all right, we've reached this philosophical reconciliation because we've understood the truth of Christianity, and so we have this reconciliation with God, and so everything should lead us to this happy end. But unfortunately, when we look around in the world around us, we don't see that reconciliation. Instead, we still see a sense of alienation. He thinks the modern world in his time, in the 1820s, is still wallowing in a strong sense of alienation. After the skepticism that arose from the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, people have begun to critically question all forms of religion, all forms of thinking. I think this has led to great confusion, which has led people to being in a deep sense of alienation and despair with themselves, with the world around them. And so he says, yeah, that there's this, but if we were to end in this way, this would give us a discordant note, so like a musical metaphor here, that a note that's not really in harmony. But he sort of says this with a sigh, but unfortunately, yes, this discordant note is actually present in reality. There's no denying it. This is the truth. I can't just say how great Christianity is and walk away. We have to acknowledge that, in fact, in the real world, we still have this alienation. And so at the end of his lectures, he ends with this interesting image where he says, philosophy represents an isolated order of priests, a sanctuary, who are untroubled about how it goes with the world, who need not mix with it, and whose work is to preserve this possession of truth. How things turn out in the world is not our affair. So the image is that philosophers, we're like monks, right? Our primary goal is just to understand. When we've understood the truth, our job is over, right? And that's what philosophy's all about. It's about knowing the truth. Well, philosophy, the love of wisdom, I guess that seems to fit. Or think of the first lines of Aristotle's Metaphysics. All men by nature desire to know, right? So knowing is a thing which is good in and of itself. Human beings are by nature curious. It's all about knowing, nothing more. But yeah, so he thinks philosophy isn't about, say, social activism or a political agitation. And he's able to accept this idea that, okay, we've got a reconciliation in thought, although we don't really have it in the real world. But that doesn't matter, because it's not philosophy's job to fix the real world anyway. It's philosophy's job just to understand. And here's, I think, an important idea for his students. So his students hear this in this time of great confusion, great turmoil, and they say that's just not good enough, right? We want to do something with philosophical ideas, and we can see this in the three thinkers that I've chosen to discuss today. The first of which is Heinrich Heine. Heine, known as primarily as a poet and a literary writer. He was born in Dusseldorf to a Jewish family, and the real experience which marked Heine's life as a young man was that he grew up in during the time of the French occupation of Dusseldorf. So this is in the Napoleonic period. Napoleon, of course, brings with him the enlightened ideas from the French Revolution with the Napoleonic Code. He grants the civil rights to everybody on equal footing, and so he enfranchises the Jews, basically. And so, yeah, Heine grew up in this atmosphere. Everything was fine, but then, with the fall of Napoleon in 1815, his hometown Dusseldorf became a part of the Kingdom of Prussia, and then all of the old anti-Semitic laws and restrictions came back again, and this was a huge shock for Heine, for his family, right, who had lived in relative freedom and equality up until this time. And so Heine developed a great sense of anger towards the state of Prussia, which he really nourished for his entire life. In 1821, he enrolled at the University of Berlin. This is where he hears Hegel's lectures. The two were actually on quite good terms, surprisingly familiar terms, considering the real hierarchical system of German universities at that time. After he completed his studies, Heine was really had enough of the reactionary politics in Prussia, of the Restoration, that is this period after the fall of Napoleon. And he moved to Paris in 1831 and was more hopeful that Paris would be, or France would be more enlightened than Prussia ever was. And he was also harassed by the censors in Prussia. Every time he published something, he had to ask, may I publish this? Is this okay? And this was, of course, not a good thing for a literary writer. Hegel, of course, had to do the same thing. And in 1835, the state of Prussia basically banned his works altogether. And so, yeah, this is a frustrating situation. Heine was, when he came to Paris, he was joined there by Karl Marx, who was actually his third cousin, in 1843, and there were other German exiles who came to Paris at this time. Heine made a trip back to Germany to visit to have a discussion with his publisher. And during this time, he wrote this wonderful poem called Germany, A Winter's Tale, where he goes from city to city and tells what he sees. And it's very satirical of Prussian military and these terrible restrictive policies of the Prussian state. And so, yeah, when this was published, then an arrest warrant was sent out and was issued for Heine. So at that point, he could never return to his homeland ever again. He spent the rest of his life in Paris. In 1833, he published a work called On the History of Religion and Philosophy in Germany. And this work originally appeared in French, and there's a series of articles where he explains to his French audience certain aspects of German culture. And here he develops a striking analogy where the discussion is about why is it that in France we had this big revolution in 1789, whereas nothing like that has taken place in Germany, even though Germany has a very high culture, particularly in the area of philosophy or social political philosophy. And so here we have a little bit this same sort of motif that Germany has had a revolution of thought, but not in the actual world. And this is pretty much Hegel's soundbite, right? We have this, we're able to find a reconciliation or move forward progressively, but it's only theoretically, it's only in thought. And so Heine uses this opportunity to make this sort of comparison and he foresees a revolution in Prussia and in the German states along the same lines as the French revolutions. And he says that this revolution is going to be led by philosophers, right? So he imagines like Kantians and Fichteans out on the streets battling in the barricades and things like this. It's really almost comic in a way, but to his credit, he foresees 1848, right? He can really see into the future what's going to happen. And he thinks that, for his own part, that philosophy plays this important role, but it needs a little bit of help if it's going to be made popular. And so he thinks here's where poetry and literature can help out, because through poetry we can get to a larger group of people and explain to them philosophical ideas in a simpler way that makes them understand more clearly the forces of oppression that they are finding in the present time, which is, of course, a powerful message. And so his most famous political poetry in this regard is a short work called The Silesian Weavers, which appeared in a journal called Vorwärts, Pariser Deutsche Zeitschrift, so the forwards, a German journal of Paris. In 1844, this is a journal edited, among others, by Karl Marx. And the subject of this is an uprising of the weavers in Peterswaldau in Silesia, East Prussia. Today it's somewhere in Poland. And the context of this was the weavers were basically self-employed people doing the weaving by hand, and their labor was becoming less and less valuable because there was new competition coming from the British, who were starting to use machines and big factories to produce the items which these guys were still weaving by hand, and so their product was losing value in that competition. And so the idea was that they would sell their products to the local merchants, and the local merchants were paying less and less every time for the products that the weavers were making. And so the weavers, they tried to work more and more, but of course you can't keep up with a machine, right? It's simply impossible. And so they reached a tipping point where they simply couldn't make a living working full-time on their weaving. And so they went in protest to the merchants who were used to buying their stuff, and they burned down houses and threatened these merchants, and this was too much for the local authorities to deal with, and so they sent in the Prussian military, which shot the protesters and things like this. So it was a terrible situation, which was sort of regarded as an important forerunner of the revolution of 1848. And so in this context, Heine writes a poem in support of these weavers and their revolt. And I say here it appears, here's the poem on the first page of the journal. And we can just go ahead and read a few stanzas here so we can get a feeling for the tone of it. It says, "In gloomy eyes there wells no tear, grinding their teeth they're sitting here. Germany, your shroud's on our loom, and in it we weave the threefold doom." We weave, we weave. So we start out in the third person, right? We're an outside observer who is describing the situation, right? There are these weavers who are sitting here and they're weaving, right? And then we turn to the first person plural, right? So now this is the weavers themselves who are speaking, and they're addressing Germany, or the German states, or Prussia collectively. It says, "Germany, your shroud is on our loom." So the shroud, they're weaving a funeral shroud for the German states and for Prussia. So there's an anticipation that, right, these guys are going to, the state of Prussia is going to die, and something new will come. So an anticipation of revolution. And in it, we're weaving the threefold doom. The threefold doom refers to the three things which he mentions in the subsequent stanzas which the Prussians had in their official oath of allegiance. And this was, okay, we start with Heine here. And the first one is God, King, and God, the King, and Fatherland. And so these are the threefold doom. And so in the body of the poem, each of the stanzas is dedicated to giving a curse on one of these. And so we start with the first one, God. Doomed to be the God who is deaf to our prayer in winter's cold and hunger's despair, and in vain we hoped and bided. He only mocked us, hoaxed and derided. We weave, we weave. So this is pretty iconoclastic stuff, right? That God is completely indifferent to the sufferings of the weavers, right? He doesn't come to their help, even though they're praying to him. Nothing really happens. And so here we can see a strong anti-religious element in this sense, a criticism of religion as not really being of any use in this difficult situation where poor people need some sort of help and that they feel abandoned by religion. Then we move on to the second half, the second part of the poem, where we have a second curse against the king. Right? Doomed be the king, the rich man's king, who would not be moved by our suffering, who tore the last coin out of our hands and let us be shot by his bloodthirsty bands. We weave, we weave. And so the king refers to the king of Prussia, right? Friedrich Wilhelm IV, who was quite a conservative monarch who came to power in 1840. He was the one who sent in the Prussian troops and allowed them to shoot at the weavers, and so he's singled out for special criticism here. And there was, of course, understandably, a great deal of anger at this, that he, in this conflict, he took the side of the merchants instead of taking the side of the weavers, and so that's why he's described here as the rich man's king. He's not the king for the weavers, right? He's left them, he's abandoned them, but instead he's supporting the interest of the rich people. And then we have the third stanza in the body of the passage, which is the curse on the fatherland. Right, the doomed be the fatherland, false name, where nothing thrives but disgrace and shame, where flowers are crushed before they unfold, where the worm is quickened by rot and mold. We weave, we weave. And so what's he saying here? That this fatherland that we're supposed to swear allegiance to is really, it's a negative thing. It doesn't, our freedoms are oppressed. We're not allowed to develop our own abilities and to develop ourselves, where the flowers are crushed in each of us as individuals. And here we can think of Heine, who has this very complex self-identity as a German Jew who doesn't really feel at home in his home country anymore and prefers to live his life in exile in France. Yeah, okay, and then we have our very final stanza, which again just sort of sums it up. The loom is creaking, the shuttle flies, nor night nor day do we close our eyes. Old Germany, your shroud's on our loom, and in it we weave the threefold doom. We weave, we weave. So it takes up again the motif of the threefold doom, which he's now explained to us. And there's something threatening about this, right? Which we don't really expect from weavers. So he's predicting, once again, the coming revolution, which is going to destroy all of the forces of the restoration and everything that stands for, including the religious institutions, including the king and the fatherland of Prussia. And nor night nor day do we close our eyes. We're watching all the time for our moment and preparing for this revolution. And so, yeah, this is a powerful statement, especially when we think of the revolutions of 1848, which come only 4 years after this. And so Yeah, this was a powerful poem that really inspired a lot of people at the time. It tapped into a sense of alienation that they felt, right, from these different institutions. So after this poem was published, only a few months later, France closed down this journal, yeah, this was not so long after this that Marx and Engels and others had to flee the country completely. And so there's some pathos in the fact that Heine became very ill in May of 1848. He had, I guess, the lead poisoning from drinking from bad water pipes, and he had to he was partially paralyzed and had to spend the rest of his life in bed. Even though he spent so many years working against the injustices of the Restoration, when the Revolution finally came, he wasn't really in much of a position to do anything about it because he was in a state of partial paralysis. But Heine is a good example of someone who spent his life in a constant state of alienation, which he really isolates in terms of individual aspects in the poem that we just looked at. And so even though Heine disagrees with Hegel's idea that philosophy should just be about understanding, he's still very much on board with the importance of the concept of alienation, which he's taking from Hegel's philosophy of religion and putting it into this political context, where it seems to fit very, very well. So we move quickly to our next thinker, another student of Hegel, Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach went to Berlin in 1824, and specifically in order to attend Hegel's lectures. And yeah, Feuerbach, he remained there for a couple of years, became completely enraptured by it, was very excited by this. And the first quotation there comes from a letter that he wrote to his father in May of 1824, where he writes back just full of enthusiasm. He says, it's only 4 weeks since I started on my courses, but they've already been infinitely useful. What was still obscure and incomprehensible before, I've understood clearly and grasped in its necessity. Through the few lectures of Hegel which I've attended so far, what only smoldered in me like tinder, I see now burst into bright flames. Right, so he's really full of, even after just hearing a couple lectures from Hegel, there's really something in his mind that clicks, that he sees, okay, this is really what I've been waiting to try to hear and to understand for a long time. And the other quotation comes from a letter that he writes to one of his former teachers. He says very much something along the same lines that he wrote to his father, that the thunder and lightning of Hegel's dialectic is the greatest good fortune that could have happened to me. So he's completely enchanted by this. I mean, ask yourself, when is the last time you came away from a class that you took that full of excitement and energy about some idea that you've heard? That doesn't happen very often. For Feuerbach, this was like really the answer to what he had felt like he had been looking for some time. And I think the tone of this is very much in line with the quotation that we read from Bakunin at the beginning. So there was really something special about Hegel that excited Feuerbach, and here he mentions specifically the idea of the dialectic, which we can talk about a little bit later. And so after he completed his degree, Feuerbach wrote a book in 1830 called Thoughts on Death and Immortality, which appeared anonymously, and here he argues against the idea of the immortality of the soul or any kind of an afterlife. And it was actually forbidden by law to argue this, to call into question this Christian dogma. And so once it was found out that he was the author of this, his position became very shaky. At the time, he was a lecturer at the University of Erlangen, and so after this, he basically his academic career was over. He lost his position and had to work for the rest of his life in relative academic isolation. Feuerbach's mostly known for this book, The Essence of Christianity, which he published in 1841. This, at the time, this was the most read book in philosophy and theology and religion of its time. Friedrich Engels looks back at this. He said, everybody was really excited about this book. We read it, and everybody became a Feuerbachian overnight. And so what was it that Feuerbach was claiming here that made people so interested? Well, he has this theory about our understanding of God and how the idea of God comes about. He says that this is his theory of projection. He says that man, first of all, sees his nature as if out of himself before he finds it in himself. His own nature is, in the first instance, contemplated by him as that of another being. So the idea is something like this, that we have a certain conception of ourselves which we regard as being not ourselves, but out in the world, and we call it God. And so this is, I don't know, you think of child psychology. This is the way when children first begin to, they perceive the world around them before they have a self-conception of who they are, that they're actually interacting with the world. But what they're aware of is there's something outside of me, something external. So Feuerbach's idea is a little bit the same here, that we're first see something outside of us, but we don't realize that we're the ones who are actually projecting aspects of ourselves out into the world and then reifying it or making it into an object and calling it God. And so he formulates this in many different ways. I've given a couple of short quotations here. So man has given objectivity to himself, but has not recognized the object as his own nature. And so the idea is when we look at God, we regard God as a completely separate and distinct being. God is different from me. And Feuerbach's point is, no, you're wrong. In fact, God is simply all of these human qualities that you have put together and magnified and have placed outside of you somewhere in the universe, in the external sphere. And it's kind of a nice insight here that we want to make God, of course, greater than human beings, or more powerful than human beings. And so, as you say, to enrich God, man must become poor. That God may be all, man must become nothing. So I think of God as great and sinless, human beings are miserable and sinful, right? And Feuerbach calls this a sense of self-humiliation, right? So that human beings have got to regard themselves in a negative way in order to regard God in a positive way. And so, yeah, this is his basic theory of projection or objectification. And Feuerbach's point is that this is also a form of alienation, that's a separation where you take certain aspects or qualities of the human and you put it somewhere else, right? You're separating those qualities from yourself and regarding it as belonging to something else, to God. And so here we have Feuerbach. And his idea of alienation comes in the sphere of religion when we're talking about God and oneself. So on this view, when I conceive of myself, I'm alienating a part of myself and putting it into God. And when I look at God, right, this is also something which I mistakenly regard as something quite different from me. And so what's Feuerbach's point here, when he gets to his conclusion, what's our takeaway from this? Well, we have to, once we realize this, right, this should really change our way of thinking about our relationship to God, namely that we should take back all of that energy, all of that focus that we have projected onto God and take it back for ourselves, to focus on ourselves and our world. So instead of sacrificing all of our human relations for the sake of something else, right, we should have our focus here on this world and on these human relations and ascribe to ourselves these positive qualities that we've otherwise alienated or put onto God. And he thinks that this is an important point. It's not just an academic philosophical insight, but it really has a very important impact on the way in which you conceive of yourself as a human being in the world, right? And that if you continue to have this idea that there is some God separate from you, other than you, that has all the good qualities, and you are completely separated from all of that, then this really is something, this self-image is going to prevent you from ever doing anything in the world. And so he writes that the work of self-conscious reason in relation to religion is simply to destroy an illusion. An illusion, however, which is by no means indifferent, but which, on the contrary, is profoundly injurious in its effects on mankind, which deprives man as well of the power of real life as of a genuine sense of truth and virtue. So it's not just that this conception of God as other is just, say, an abstract philosophical topic. This is he calls it this pernicious illusion. This is a negative thing that we really need to fight against. And he thinks, so he also has this conception of this is a revolutionary idea, that once people realize this and that they drop this idea of God as being this separate other and regarded this is basically human nature itself, and this is what we are, then this is going to completely change the world. It's going to change the way people think about themselves and our institutions. And so Feuerbach also has it's kind of a revolutionary conclusion here in the sphere of religion, whereas Heine, his idea of revolution was clearly in the political sphere. So this brings us to our last thinker that we want to talk about briefly, Karl Marx. Marx came to Berlin in 1836, 5 years after Hegel had died. He initially wanted to study law, but became very interested in philosophy. He hoped to attain an academic position, but his reputation as a radical prevented him from doing that, and so he lived for many years just trying to make a living as a journalist. He also, as we mentioned before, moved to Paris, where he edited the journal, the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher, together with Arnold Ruge, another of Hegel's students. And of course, we know that Marx was ultimately thrown out of Paris, thrown out of France, and then later he moved to Belgium, was thrown out of Belgium, and then later moved back to Cologne, was thrown out of Cologne. So after being expelled from these three states, he ended up in, as we know, in England and London, where he spent the rest of his life. And so, Marx, in 1844, he published quite an important article, important if you ask me. It's not one that people read that much, but he was working on a larger manuscript, which was a criticism of Hegel's book, which we refer to as the Philosophy of Right, that is Hegel's statement of his social political philosophy. And Marx, he had a bad habit of starting a lot of works he never finished, right? So a lot of his material is in manuscript form, but here he managed to publish at least the introduction to this, and so we have an introduction to a criticism of Hegel's philosophy of right. So that's the one part he published. The other parts we have in manuscript form, where he comments on individual sections of Hegel's book, which are quite insightful, actually. And this, I think, is a key text because it illustrates this transition that we're talking about, moving from Hegel to Feuerbach to Marx, focusing on this idea of alienation. And so Marx begins here by saying that the criticism of religion has largely already been completed. And he's very positive about this, and so he's thinking of the work of Feuerbach, among others, right? So what does Feuerbach do? He criticizes our conception of religion, right? And regards this as something that gives us a new way of thinking about this. There were other people, also students of Hegel, he has in mind here, David Friedrich Strauss, Bruno Bauer, who also regarded religion as being very oppressive to human freedom and to individual thinking. So Marx salutes this. I think this is a great thing, right? This criticism of religion has really made some great headway. We're happy about that, but it's already completed. And here he really continues exactly where it looks like Feuerbach left off, right? He says, man who is found in that fantastic reality of heaven, where he's not a supernatural being, only his own reflection, will no longer be tempted to find only the semblance of himself, a non-human being, where he seeks and must seek his true reality. And so, yeah, very much Feuerbach's idea that the idea of God is an illusion. Instead, people should put their focus back on the here and now, on the reality of this world. And so, well, this is kind of an interesting idea, because let's see, move on to the next part of it. We're used to associating Marx with this social political philosophy or economics and things like this. We don't usually think of him as a great philosopher of religion or somebody who's particularly interested in religion or influenced by it. But here we can see it, right? Where he's very interested in this model of alienation in the context of religion, which comes from Hegel's philosophy initially and then from Feuerbach subsequently. And what does he say? The criticism of religion is the premise of all criticism. So Feuerbach has shown us the way with his critical view of religion, but we need to transfer that critical view to other areas as well, to society, to economics, to the other spheres. And Marx says, that's my job. That's what I'm going to dedicate myself to doing. And so we see, what does he say? The immediate task of philosophy, which is in the service of history, is to unmask human self-alienation in its secular form, now that it has been unmasked in its sacred form. So Feuerbach has already done the first job. He's unmasked it in the sacred form, and now we need to find the source of human self-alienation in society, right, in another form. And so again, with a line like that, you can see it's a smooth transition for him between religion and social thinking. And so this is the thing that we're not used to thinking of Marx in these terms, but his concept of alienation, which is, I guess, of these three people, he's probably the one who's most known for it. It actually comes from this context of religion. And here, what does he say here? At the bottom, he has this idea that he's also taking from Heinrich Heine, that in politics, Germans have thought what other nations have done. Germany has been their theoretical consciousness, and so there has been a real French Revolution, but the Germans have thought this ahead of time and can also play an important role in the revolution. Marx develops his theory of alienated labor in the manuscripts, economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, also manuscripts that he never himself published, never completed. And here this is his famous account. He goes through several different forms of alienation. The most important one is the alienation from the product of one's labor. So what's his idea here? That when you are working, say, in the factory system or something like that, you are spending all this time and effort to make a product and you're getting paid a wage for it, but you're alienated from that product because it's not yours, right? You can't do with it what you want to. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the owner of the factory, right? And so you don't have that same emotional or spiritual relationship to the object as, say, a weaver or a hand worker who's working on the product themselves, right, with their own hands here, and owns their own products. And so, yeah, in this sense, the product confronts the worker in his terms as something alien, as an alien object. It's something different from oneself, which one doesn't identify with. It's not like if you're an artist, right? You make a great work of art, you put yourself into it, right? You identify with it. If you're working for a wage, this is not the case, right? The object is something that has a greater distance to you than your own work of art. And so here you have this ninth line, which again brings the whole thing back to religion. It's the same in religion. The more man puts into God, the less he retains in himself. The worker puts his life into the object, but now his life no longer belongs to him, but to the object, right? So a similar idea from Feuerbach, right, where we invest everything in some external other, right, God, but we lose it for ourselves. So also in this Marx's conception of labor practices of his day in the capitalist system, right, we're losing ourselves when we are making products for a wage. And so for Marx, then, if we can continue our graphic here, we have, he talks about alienation in this economic sphere, primarily, the sphere of labor, and we're alienated from, he gives a series of things, we'll just stick with the one, the product. Of our labor. It's also, is it the form of labor, the fact that how you work, you're alienated from, also alienates us from other people. It alienates us from our individual essence. All of these things might take us too long to get into, so we just stick to the one. Yeah, and so the last thing we want to say about Marx is we want to discuss his 11th thesis on Feuerbach. So he wrote a series of 11 theses, which again remained in manuscript form for many years. Engels found them among his papers, published them many, many years after the fact. And the most famous one of these is one where he seems critical of Feuerbach. Most of the theses individually, they have Feuerbach's name written on them, and so it's clear. That's why they're called theses on Feuerbach. Here, it's not about Feuerbach necessarily explicitly, but he has Feuerbach clearly in mind here. What does he say? The philosophers only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it, right? There's this a slogan which appears in what is today the Humboldt University. When you go in, right, in the stairs, it's written right there to inspire the young students. And so here, this is a critical thought aimed at Feuerbach. And so at first, Marx was very enthusiastic about Feuerbach, because we saw he's borrowing a lot of this Feuerbach's conception of alienation in the religious sphere and is putting it into this other sphere. But now he's critical. Why is that? It's because this idea of alienation in the religious sphere, and Feuerbach's idea that once we realize that and we can overcome that alienation in our thoughts and our minds, for Marx, that's not good enough, right? And that's not a real revolution in the real world. And so he puts Feuerbach into the same category as Hegel, as somebody who's sort of complacent, is just happy to understand this dynamic and not do anything about it. One can argue to what degree that is accurate of Feuerbach, because Feuerbach does seem to think that once you have this idea, there are necessary implications which will change how you're living your life and how you're interacting with others. But in any case, this is Marx's idea. So, what can we say here by way of conclusion here, just to wrap up? We've seen that each of these figures, right, Heine, Feuerbach, Marx, they're all working in slightly different areas, and they have a certain conception that they share with Hegel about what Hegel calls spirit, what they're talking about with the rationality or freedom. Right? And so for individuals to become truly free, they need to use their rationality and reject those things in the world which are not rational, in which they can't find themselves. Well, that's a theory of revolution, isn't it? Right? Which Hegel is certainly, he sort of planted in these people's minds without really being so clear about it. And so starting with Hegel's theory of alienation and religion, his students are inspired to develop their own ideas, and each of them played in his own way a certain role in the revolutions of 1848. Right? So remember, Marx was in Brussels at the time, was agitating for the revolution. This is the reason why the Kingdom of Belgium expelled him from the country, right? You come here and make a revolution, this is not good. But for Hegel, right, this is the way in which in which history progresses, right? We slowly get rid of different irrational or reactionary customs which stand in the way of the full development of our freedom and rationality. And so, what else do we want to say here? So we began here with Hegel's assessment, the discordant note in the philosophy of religion, that there is a clear perception of an alienation in the modern world. And each of these thinkers take it and apply it to a different sphere. We have Heine in the political sphere, Feuerbach in the religious sphere, and Marx in the socio-economic sphere. And each of them try to diagnose this in their own way. Whoops, I guess we don't have the current version of this, so I will continue our map here. So let's think of this in terms of both a diagnosis to the problem and a solution to a problem. So the diagnosis is that we're right, alienation is there in these different areas, and so for Heine, right, the diagnosis is what we're alienated from is, right, religion, God. We're alienated from, right, the government, the king. We're also alienated from the fatherland of Prussia. These are three key elements of alienation, and the only possible form of reconciliation that you could have would be a political revolution, right? And so the diagnosis is alienation on these areas, and his solution is, his reconciliation is revolution. Okay. We go to Feuerbach. He also believes there is a point of alienation, as Hegel said, and this is our relationship to God. Our understanding of God is something other, and the failure to realize that God is just ourselves, right? Something which we have projected out into the external world, and so this leaves us with a sense of self-alienation. And so what does Feuerbach propose? Well, let's realize that once we understand the truth of his theory, right, we realize that God is not something other, that God is just my own thoughts and ideas that I regard somewhere out there in the world, that I should apply that thought, energy, and focus to myself, to this real world, right? And instead of sacrificing my other human relations to the relation with God, I should cultivate my relations with the world. And so Feuerbach also has an idea of, once we realize this, reconciliation is possible. It can be done with a way of thinking and with changing our way of acting in the world. And then with Marx, he sees this sense of alienation in the social economic sphere, where he talks about the way in which production is done in the modern world and the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And Marx says that this causes a huge sense of alienation for the individual worker with the products that they're working with, their working time and so forth. And for him, what's his solution? Right? So the diagnosis it's quite clear. The thing that you are alienated from is the way in which you have to do the work and the product of your work. How do we get rid of this problem? How do we create a reconciliation? Well, you have a revolution once again, right? You have a revolution and you change the economic system so that the means of production are owned in common, and then this will give everybody a certain sense of identification or reconciliation with the products which everybody is producing, right? And this is the theory in any case, and so what I submit then is that if you want to understand the history of philosophy in the 19th century, you can find certain themes like this which can run through the entire century, and which start out with one basic idea from Hegel, which turns out to be really the fruitful seed which gets developed through his students throughout actually many decades after the fact, after Hegel has died, but still continue to play a very important role throughout the rest of the century. And if you just think of how important the concept of alienation is today in the social sciences, right, and philosophy and many different fields, you can really see that this is an idea which has had an enormous influence. You can really see this as one of the 19th century's major contributions to 20th century thinking. So I apologize for going on for so long there, but I will stop and say thank you for your attention and your interest. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really a fantastic performance. So now a little talk, a philosophical talk. I would ask you first that obviously we attach the 19th century with a scientific revolution, with the industrial revolution, so with those profound ideas or profound images of how people lived in that at the times. Proliferation of university education, a middle class emerged in the social terms. You claim, on contrary, in your book that we should understand that the 19th century, the idea and the idea of religion, and that religion was a formative, a most important idea that was reflected in philosophical concepts and in philosophical schools, predominantly by Hegel, and as you have shown. So could you please elaborate on that? That how, why should we consider religion as being the most, or one of the most important ideas to understand the development of the 19th century?
Yeah, thanks. That's an important question, I think, because when scholars today do work on the history of philosophy, it's very difficult to transport oneself back into that world, into that context, and to see really how people at that time thought, how they perceived the world. That's what all the problem of any historian, whether it's history of philosophy or another form of history. But I think there's a real tendency in modern philosophy to ignore this religious side, and the reason for that, I guess, it's quite obvious. And most modern philosophy is quite secular, it's quite atheistic, frankly. And so when people do history of philosophy, they are looking for certain sorts of topics and issues which are relevant for what they regard as the philosophical agenda today, which is quite secular. I mean, there are some people doing certain kinds of philosophy of religion, but yeah, it's not such a mainstream thing the religion doesn't play the central role that it did back in the 19th century. I guess that's my point. And so when people look at these thinkers from the 19th century and these religious topics pop up, quite a lot actually, they're not interested in pursuing them. Oh, this is just silly religious stuff. This doesn't really play such an important role. Let's just ignore this and get to the really important stuff that they have to say. And I think that's a mistake. That's can you say, it's just kind of an ethnocentric, if you will, way of understanding the history of philosophy, where one makes use of our own academic world and uses that as the model by which to understand or even judge a period in the past. And here, I think we've seen here that these religious ideas and topics are absolutely central to the discussion. Right? We can see this. It starts from the Enlightenment and carries on in this period where the Enlightenment raises all these critical questions about religion. And so as the heirs of the Enlightenment in this generation of Hegel and then later Feuerbach and others, they're stuck trying to deal with the fallout of that, right? Is religion just a silly sort of superstition that we should abandon completely, or is it like Hegel says, oh, there are still some deep truths with religion that we just have to understand correctly in a philosophical way and then move on in that sense. And that's why I think Marx was right, that the criticism of religion during this period was so rich, because you had so many different thinkers approaching trying to make sense of this issue and try to preserve religion in one way or another, or to criticize it in different ways. It's very rich, but I think all of that is completely lost in so many of the modern discussions in philosophy about this period, where religion doesn't play any role at all. Well, you can't really abstract these concepts like alienation from the discussion of religion.
Yeah. So the idea behind it is something like that. Certain valuable ideas are being sort of trapped in the frame of theology, right. in the frame of discussions between the priests, and the idea is to take those ideas which are fruitful and to unleash them, so to say, from this dogmatic kind of interpretation, and to use them since Hegel and thought he can make use of them in philosophical terms. So is this the idea of philosophy as a sort of substitution of theological elaborations which were so predominant in the era before, like 17th, 18th century?
Yeah, the word substitution, that's not a bad way to characterize it, I think. Because Hegel, he's actually, in these lectures on philosophy of religion, he's quite critical of the theologians. He thinks the theologians in their Christian apologetics, when they're trying to defend Christianity, they're making all sorts of mistakes and are playing right into the hands of the atheists and the Enlightenment critics of religion. He says that they're taking the wrong strategy, so he wants to come in and save Christianity, to save the theologians. He irritated a lot of theologians with this argument, but I think that you're right that his strategy is to say that if you're going to find a firm, enduring truth of religion, it can't be found in, say, stories from the Bible or these sort of anecdotal things or these edifying sermons that you hear, but rather it has to be conceptual. And that what does philosophy do? It works in concepts. And so the idea is that you can find in religious stories, for example, or religious dogmas, a deeper philosophical truth, but it has to be translated into the terms of concepts. And I think the most obvious example he gives us this is the doctrine of the Trinity, which is so important to Christianity, right? It's what separates Christianity from the other monotheistic religions, where we have the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, right? These are all, in a certain sense, Feuerbach would say anthropomorphic terms, whereas Hegel says, okay, there's a deep truth in this, but we have to understand that in a different way. God the Father, that is what we in philosophy call the universal, right? Or the particular, well, that's what we call the incarnation, the revelation of Christ, the particular God. And then, right, this moves on to the Holy Spirit, which combines the two. And for Hegel, right, this is the particular which falls under the universal, which creates the triad. And so that's what Hegel means when he thinks, all right, we can, this he believes is an absolute truth, which is there and will endure forever. And Christianity understands it in a different way, maybe with images, with stories, but it is, in its essence, true, he thinks.
Hegel was a quite how to say, self-conscious thinker. Those who know and those who read Hegel know that he believed that his philosophy was the terminal stage of philosophy as such, that basically that's Hegelian philosophy is a grand completion of the history of ideas, and since that moment everybody will only stick to Hegelian method of dialectics, and basically that's the end. Is it so that he thought he transposed those very strong and rich history of religious thought into the philosophical system, which he believed is basically the end game of thinking of the Western civilization, or basically the Germany of the time, isn't the story you just told in its essence the refutation of that, basically, that he didn't succeed because this is the heresies, basically, what they did, Heine, Feuerbach and Marx, to the Hegelian system.
Yeah, right. This is a matter of Hegel interpretation. And you're right. There is this one interpretation of Hegel, which is usually it usually takes its point of departure in the things he says at the end of his lectures on the philosophy of history, where he does use language sort of like this, that now we have reached the end of history and this is the culmination of it, and a little bit in the way he talks about Christianity with respect to religion, right? That Christianity is the absolute religion, right? It's reached a certain stage of development, which is far beyond what the earlier religions have reached, and so now we can't improve on whatever the absolute, and so we've reached the final point. But I think that's a bit of a caricature, actually, that the Hegel that in my interpretation is one who, it's the Hegel of the dialectic, the one who recognizes that there is constantly movement in history, there is constantly development. And when he talks about this idea of the end point, what he means there is the sense of what he calls subjective freedom, right? That we have reached, once we reach a point where we recognize ourselves as free, independent, self-conscious beings in all that that entails, right? And so think of all of human history where it's taken us to get to this point where we are today, where we recognize each other as having certain inalienable rights, right? I can't go and enslave somebody, right? You have the absolute right to certain things, and we have tried to also install this in our institutions, our political institutions, our other institutions, that this is something we completely take for granted today in many ways, whereas in earlier times this was not the case. They had a very different understanding of what it was to be human, a very much lower understanding, and people didn't have these rights. It wasn't thought of that you had this absolute right and that you were a free individual. And so in this sense, Hegel thinks once you reach that point of the freedom he's talking about, you can't go beyond it, right? You can't become freer than free, right? But I think what he does recognize is that there is a long historical movement and trajectory which is still going on today, which is constantly refining that, what we mean by what it is to be free, what it is to recognize each other as free individuals. You could think of this in simple ways, the way in which we've constantly broadened our concept of what it is to include other people in what we think of as human. Right? It wasn't, I mean, even back in Hegel's time, right? The time of colonization, right? The European colonization of the Americas, of Africa, of Asia, they didn't regard the native individuals as fully human, right? And so they didn't extend to them certain rights.
So what's the milestone for Hegel in history? Is it the French Revolution? Actually, can we get back to a little bit biographical consideration on Hegel? He was 19 at the time. He spent his high school times in Tübingen with Schelling and Hölderlin, very good friends, exactly during 1789 to I guess 93. So was the French Revolution that formative experience which he considered to be a starting point of this free, like this is the point when the man is free and cannot be freer?
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. I think the French Revolution had a huge impact on him and everybody in his generation. And so this was the time when Hegel was studying in the Tübingen Theological Seminary, right? He thought he was going to become a pastor, and this was the time when this was like a very reactionary, old-school institution of education, right? The students were really treated badly, were allowed very few freedoms, and Hegel and his fellow students, which included, I should say, a number of very famous people like Schelling, like Hölderlin, they were reading the newspapers coming from France and hearing about everything that was happening in the revolution. And of course, they had to get these newspapers in secret and read them in secret and talk about them in secret. But everybody was really excited about this. For them, this was the beginning of a new epoch, which was really going to change society completely. And I think Hegel was really caught up in this view. It caused really a conflict between him and his father, actually. But then, of course, we know this famous anecdote when Hegel was finishing the phenomenology of spirit. This is when the Battle of Vienna was going on, and he sees Napoleon in the streets of Vienna on a horse. He's really very much inspired by this in 1806, 1807. Yeah, but then also in his works, he becomes a little bit more critical of that when he sees the reign of terror and how the revolution develops. But still, the fundamental principles of the revolution, he still, I think, that still sticks with him, is very much at the heart of his idea of subjective freedom, of what it is to be an individual and to be rational, to determine for oneself, and to recognize others in the same way.
I have just two more questions. But the first one: how do you explain the situation? How did it happen that Hegel is Hegel's image? I mean, in general, is as a reactionary thinker. This is what we learned in philosophic courses. I think not only in Czechoslovakia, but it's said also everywhere on other places. So how come is his philosophical image so perverted in a sense? Because what you say and what you argue for is that he was in essence somewhere rooted in this revolutionary progressive idea.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we can. When Friedrich Engels looks back on his period in Berlin, and he says what it was specifically they found about Hegel that was so exciting. He refers to Hegel's dialectic, this idea of a dialectic in history where one society sort of has certain principles, operates in a certain way, and then certain contradictions arise and it falls and another society comes. Again, what I described as Hegel's format for revolution in a certain sense. He says that dynamic side of Hegel was what was really fascinating to the students of that generation, and not the dogmatic Hegel. But I think to answer your question, the reason that Hegel has got such a bad name or has become caricatured with these kind of silly misreadings is that it has more to do with the academic atmosphere of our own times than with Hegel's own writings. So when I was a student and was starting out became interested in Hegel, Hegel was not a well-seen figure in the Anglophone world of philosophy, which was dominated at that time by academic or analytic philosophy. And so for analytic philosophy, they really disliked this idea that history or culture can play a role in the development of concepts. And so, yeah, this is a much longer story than I can get into, but there were a lot of really, quite frankly, silly and absurd things written about Hegel in the post-war period coming out of analytic philosophy. If you read Bertrand Russell's famous History of Western Philosophy, right, which was written right after the war, it's just an absurd caricature what he says about Hegel there. I mean, it's really, I mean, it's laughable when compared by modern standards of research. And I think for whatever reason, analytic philosophy just wanted to disregard him as just complete nonsense, and so it's been a long road to help Hegel to have a comeback and become a respectable figure in modern philosophy. But again, that's the fault of our modern academic philosophical culture. It has nothing to do with Hegel or his writings.
Yeah, I know this equation saying that Hegel plus Haeckel, who was this predecessor of genetic theory, gives fascism. I don't know if this is what I have seen somewhere in the paper. So even attribute to Hegel this proto-fascistic or as a predecessor of some kind of a fascistic ideas. Okay, so my last question, and you touched it already before, but I think we should explain when talking about Hegel the dialectical method, at least for a while. Because this is what Feuerbach and his students refer to as the most precious, and this is probably the source of philosophical fascination. So how would you explain what is the dialectical method applied in Hegel teaching?
We can explain this in a number of different ways. Maybe the simplest way is to think about this as a relationship of one thing to another, a relationship of opposites. And so how do we determine things that we see around us in our world? How do we distinguish one thing from another? And Hegel, in his Science of Logic, he gives this long, complicated, difficult story about how the different categories work. And so we have a certain category, the category of being, the first category that he starts with. And you can't, he argues you can't have, this is the most basic category you can think of, what is pure being. Try to close your eyes and imagine what is pure being. And he argues in order to understand that as a concept, you need another concept, that is nothingness, right? The opposite of pure being, right? And so you have being here, where being stops, you have the nothingness, right? But that means those two concepts are necessarily bound together, right? You can't have pure being just on its own as a concept. You can't have pure nothingness just on its own. But the way he formulates it, the one produces the other. The one needs the other to exist. And then his idea of the reconciliation of these two opposites is the third concept of becoming, where the two opposites are united together, where it's becoming as part being and part nothing. And he goes through, in the Science of Logic, many, many different triads like this, where he takes opposites together in this way and shows that these opposites are always mediated by a third concept. And so if you can think of this in terms of historical development, and here's where it was interesting for Marx and for Engels, where you can think of a certain society as being something positive, right? Something like pure being, but it can't exist like that on its own. It can't just have a certain self-definition, but how do we define ourselves? It's always in contrast to something else, to another society, right? We're different from those guys, right? And so you produce your other, right? You produce, in politics as well, you have a certain policy, a certain theory, and what happens? You produce an opposition, right? You produce others who have a pushback, and then when one either has a revolution or one gets into communication with the other people, one has a form of mediation or reconciliation. And so I think that's the understanding of dialectic that Hegel's students had, which they found so fascinating, because it helps us understand so many different things, like the way things work in the social world, or the way history works, that there really is an underlying sort of a logic which is going on there. That's not just this crazy chaos of individual things happening, but in fact, when you try to understand it in terms of this framework, it does seem to have a certain explanatory power.
Definitely, everybody who is a teacher or has this experience of teaching knows that it's very hard to explain to students, to someone who don't know any concept from within, so to say. Like let's say, like what is rationalism? When the students don't know Descartes, they don't know almost nothing about it. But the situation entirely changes when you say it's the opposite of empiricism, because that's the first step you can do. So the student get the point already that, okay, I don't know what rationalism is, but it's the opposite of empiricism, which I know. So that's basically a very, very powerful explanatory and didactic idea also. And maybe that's also the source why his students were so much fascinated by him. He must have been a really good professor, a teacher. As we know, these lectures in Berlin were basically taking place on squares. There were like thousands of people coming, so that were public manifestations and public happenings.
Yeah, Hegel was, this is funny, the anecdotal information you get, he was actually a pretty bad lecturer, according to all accounts. I mean, people were fascinated with the content, of course, of what he was saying, but it sounds like he was kind of a nervous guy. According to accounts, he would come up to the lectern and would sort of sneeze or wheeze a little bit. He wasn't really comfortable giving lectures. And there were probably different reasons from that, but there was something about the atmosphere that was created due to the ideas, and I think that was really the key thing. When you had so many really gifted young thinkers there coming together, these ideas are, of course, going to push some buttons, particularly in that academic context during this period in the Restoration where everybody's a little bit dissatisfied with what's going on. And then, of course, some of these ideas are going to look quite incendiary. And we have to keep in mind that for Hegel's lectures, he had sitting in the agents from the Russian Secret Service or police force or whatever, and so he had to be careful what he said or else he would lose his job. Right? He couldn't say something which contradicted Christian dogma, for example. He couldn't do what Feuerbach did. He couldn't deny the theory of the immortality of the soul. So he had to be very careful about the way in which he formulated it, and this is where the interpretation problem becomes very difficult. Did he really mean it when he said this? Or what did he mean when he said this? Because one of his ways of protecting himself was to formulate his position in a way which was very complex. As we all know, reading Hegel isn't always so fun. It comes in a really difficult academic jargon. And I think the reason for this is, well, he wanted to make sure that these guys who were sitting in on his lectures and were ready to catch him at something, that they could never pin him down exactly on something which was, for example, religiously heretical.
Yeah, that's nice insight, actually. I hope, I don't know, maybe there are some secret service, secret police agents here. That would be nice, but I am afraid it's not the case. Anyway, now it's time for your questions, and if there is no question, then we can think here that all of you are secret agents.
Hi, hello. Thanks for a beautiful performance. I actually believe it was a performance. But okay, yeah. My question is that well, I have to defend I have to defend cultural sociology a little bit, as it's the science that allows thinking about religion in modern era. And as you said, the role of religion is quite important for us, and in a sense, it's a way of interpretation of social reality. In a way, let's make it equal to culture, to Geist in a Hegelian sense. But my question is like very, very simple, and I just want to ask, because I see the point of making the distinction between interpretation and action, like Hegel and Marx. What's your point? What's your position? Isn't this simply a kind of dialectic between action and interpretation?
Right.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I think you're right. I think if you want to take up a critical discussion of this issue, we say, okay, is Hegel right about this idea of which he's ascribed to him, that we just have this theoretical reconciliation, or his critics, right? No, we need action as well. Hegel actually in another part of his philosophy, he discusses this, and exactly this idea that what he calls the concept, right, which follows this movement of universal to particular and a unity. He makes exactly this point, right? That what the concept is, it follows exactly this dialectical movement of thought and action in the movement. So if you can think of, I imagine I have a thought of building a house, right? I make a blueprint. It's in my mind. It's just a thought. It's a universal, right? It could turn out in an infinite number of ways. We don't know. But then I go to work. I build the house to try to make it in accordance with my idea. So that's action. That's practice in the real world. It makes my idea. It brings my abstract idea into actuality. Right? And then we sit back after I have built my house and we can compare, right? Does the particular house match the universal concept of the house that I started out with when I did the blueprints and so forth? And then if that's the case, then we will have the kind of triad that Hegel's talking about. And so he's not naive or blind to the problem, right? And for him, the actual world is an important part of the concept itself, right? And so I think your question is exactly on target there, that Hegel's not just about abstract theoretical thinking. Let's just stick with the abstract idea here. No, I mean, to be an idea, it's in opposition to something, right? To that idea manifested in the real world. And so, once again, you're in a dialectical relationship, right? You can't understand anything in the world without having an idea about it, right? How do I know that's a chair, right? Because I have an idea of a chair in my mind, and I can compare that object with it. And yeah, we do it all the time. And so I guess it's, to me, a sympathetic aspect of Hegel's idealism. Right? Usually when we think of idealistic thinkers, it's like one static thing, right? Truth, beauty, justice, like Plato's ideas, right? But for Hegel, the idea, it's a movement, right? It's a thought and a reality in a dialectical relationship with one another.
One more?
Hello, thank you for the great presentation. And my question for you would be, if you were to put yourself into the shoes of Hegel, you mentioned that analytical philosophy, when it came up and it rose after Hegel died, how would you defend Hegel's position against the criticism that analytic philosophy brought in? And from my understanding, this would be like logical inconsistencies in his language and the way how some arguments don't follow after certain transitions. And yeah, in general, how would you defend Hegel against these kind of logical criticisms?
Yeah, that's a big question. That's a really big question. You're right to point this out, that this is one of the things that the analytic philosophers really hated about Hegel, with what he's calling the science of logic. It's actually a bit of a misnomer, because what he's doing there isn't, I mean, he has a certain section on it, which of course, where he talks about syllogistic logic, which we would call logic today, but most of it, it's about metaphysics, right? It's not really, strictly speaking, about logic. And so when analytic philosophers look at that, and it doesn't look like anything at all that they can even compare what they're doing with, that they say, this is just stupid. This has nothing to do with real logic, right? Modern predicate logic or something like that, or this, if you will, this dialectic, this logic of opposites that Hegel's so interested in. He thinks this is just, the analytic philosophers are entirely dismissive of this. And yeah, what can you say? I mean, one can defend this or not. One can find this sympathetic or not. But I mean, these are two quite different philosophical directions. But you can say, in Hegel's defense, that he's very careful about, I mean, he's redefining basic concepts fundamentally in order to make his system work. So you know, the concept of contradiction, right? He has a look at it and thought, okay, what does Aristotle say about contradiction? Okay, that he thinks for different reasons this is wrong. Let's reconceive of contradiction in this way, in terms of a dialectic of opposites. Well, okay, I mean, on his own premises, that there is a certain logic to it. I mean, people can say it's not, as historically it hasn't proven to have been as sustainable as modern predicate logic, but yeah, what can you say? I think the mistake is we're comparing, in a sense, two quite different things, right? In judging the one by the standard of the other.
One more.
Thank you. Do you find some Hegel's ideas dangerous or misused in history? Because we know, for example, Karl Popper's famous critique that he considered Hegel as one of the fathers of modern totalitarianism, his deification of a state, of a fight for dominance among nations, of war, and this well-known ideas. So what do you think about this? Maybe in the context of the current situation in Russia-Ukraine conflict. So do you see some ideas of Hegel that pertain and cause some negative consequences?
Yeah, I think that this is one of what I take to be one of the historical misinterpretations of Hegel, which has had a long history, unfortunately, where people, I mean, this also goes back to Bertrand Russell. I mean, people try to hold Hegel responsible for fascism or for the Second World War, for all sorts of things. And you think, well, where are people getting this from? Where is this in Hegel's philosophy, actually? And what they try to point to is certain formulations that he has in his political philosophy, his philosophy of right, which seems to glorify the state as being like the most important, the highest instance, and to crush the individual. And Hegel wants to rule out any form of individual freedom or anything like that. And yeah, what can you say? There's my understanding is that this is a mistake because all of Hegel's philosophy of history, it's all about the development of the freedom of the individual, right? Also his political philosophy. I mean, it's true, he looks at this in a hierarchical fashion. He goes through different institutions and it ends up in the highest institutions with the state, but that's not to say he rules out individual freedom. He tries to create within his ideal state the certain concrete institutions which preserve the right of the individual, protect the right of the individual. And these are institutions which didn't exist in Prussia at the time. So we're talking about things like public trial by jury, or what else? Things like conscientious objection to military service if you have whatever, certain ethical objections. And so these are modern concepts and things that we, I think, value today that show that Hegel puts a high value on protecting the sphere of the individuality and the private sphere, and is not just some proto-fascist or something who wants to say the state rules and that's the end of it. I mean, he also has in his idea of a state as one of a constitutional monarchy, and so you have a division of powers there. You have a democratic system of checks and balances and things of this sort. And so, yeah, I think. How can I say that in the history of the reception of this, it's been muddied and blurred a bit, of course, due in large part to the complexity of the painful nature of German history in the 20th century, right? And so people try to find explanations for how did this happen, and they try to find certain aspects of German culture in order to make sense of it. And so I think Hegel's been a victim of this a little bit. And people who want to associate with fascism or stuff like this, I think these are people who have a certain negative disposition about Germany or German culture, and who haven't necessarily read that much of Hegel or understand Hegel's thoughts. So you're absolutely right to raise this question. It's an important one, and really a complex one in the history of the reception of not just Hegel but other German philosophers as well.
Yeah. At this point, I would finish the discussion. We can continue then maybe at the bar. Just to add maybe a small thought that philosophers tend to underscore differences just to highlight their originality. It's a typical feature of a philosophical discussion. So maybe that's also a partly case with this relationship of Popper to Hegel and many other cases like that. We used to misinterpret the others just to show ourselves as being more interesting as philosophers. This is the history of philosophy. This is a feature, not a bug. So that may be also my 5 cents to this debate. And what I particularly liked about your book and about your philosophical heuristics and approach is you do exactly the opposite. You are underscoring, stressing the continuities, the showing really the hidden agenda, how it pertains to and how it is being absorbed by the coming and forthcoming generations of thinkers. So this idea of continuity, exactly the idea of dialectics in the history of philosophy, is what I like, and this book is in my view a beautiful example of that approach. So this would be the end. I would recommend all of you to have the book from Jon Stewart, which is really wonderfully written. It reads well. It got the big prize, and also read Hegel. We have a wonderful translation of Phenomenology of Spirit from Patricia Alexova, maybe some years already in Slovakia. So I am sure it is not being sold out yet. So thank you very much, Jon, for coming. Thank you for coming, finding a wonderful audience, and good night and good luck.
Thank you.